mean, we have a rampant problem of excuses in our culture.
It was about me. If you came in to buy a cell phone, you didn't want to hear, well, it's someone else's fault. No,
Right.
You were working with me. And so a lot of it's just understanding, hey, as we're covering and moving, the laws of compat, it is your team. It is our team. We are part of a team. Good day and welcome to the Consultant Coach podcast. I'm here with my good friend Josh. And hey, a little extreme ownership today, my friend.
Woo, extreme ownership, getting after it.
Absolutely. And one of the most popular books out there, and to this day, Extreme Ownership is the best Audible version of any book I've ever heard.
It's great. I don't do a lot of Audible, and I loved it. It was pretty fun.
It is. But hey, what's our devotion for the day?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for those of us who are Christians, and if you hear this book, I think it's not hard to make the leap to the really the eternal perspective on love and accountability that this book, I think, underlying concept sort of alludes to, even if it's not based in that. But John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. And I think it's this idea that extreme ownership at its core, for those of us who are Christians, we can think about that as extreme love, right? And ultimately that's what we see in kind of perfect form in how we view our faith and who Jesus is. And so this resonates with people of faith because there's this recognition that we are called to be accountable as God basically sent his Son to save us. So it's tied, very closely into the faith in terms of the mindset and how we.
So if anything, we see extreme ownership from God.
Yeah.
And he's like, hey, I am God, I am perfect, and I'm not going to wait on you to do this. I'm going to do the work myself. Yep. I'm going to send my Son to do it.
Yep. And we can't ever match that. But then the calling is to reciprocate that level of ownership, that level of love to God, but also to people around us. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think it resonates closely with Christian.
Whether or not you are a Christian or not, it does resonate as we talk about extreme ownership. And this is one of my favorite books. Such a favorite book. I made it one of the key reading material for all leaders at my private company that I'm CEO for. If you are a leader in our company, you have to read this book. If you are in business and you have any sort of responsibility, you have to read this book. It so resonates. And for myself, what resonated for me is I used to there are all sorts of problems in business. And it's so-and-so's problem. It's this problem. It's this problem. He would say, yes, Jocko and Leif Babin, Jocko Willink and Leif Babin, who write the book, would say, absolutely, there are problems. They're talking about war in Iraq. But they're also in charge of all of their problems. Mm-hmm. You never read the book and say, hey, it's the president's fault. You never read and, hey, it's Al-Qaeda's fault. You always see, hey, it's their fault and this is what they can do about it, which is so empowering.
Yeah. Well, and I think I'd be curious to know what your staff think about it, because I suspect it can cause one of two reactions. One is you sort of feel called to a higher level of authority, accountability, control. I think a lot of people in our culture, it rubs them off because...
Oh, it does?
We have a rampant problem of excuses in our culture. And I found it to be not a frustrating book, but afterwards, it was sort of like you don't see something until all of a sudden it opens you buy a certain kind of car and all of a sudden you see that car everywhere. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until I heard this book on, was really thinking about it, and then all of a sudden I started hearing excuses everywhere. No one was taking accountability in terms of just a couple of days after I read it. That's extreme. But,
so, what you're saying is if you like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, do not read this book. If you have a sense of peace in your head all the time, you don't notice any problems, especially at work, do not read this book. The moment you read this book, you'll notice there are problems everywhere.
Well, and people don't take ownership for those problems, right? There's just this complete lack of discipline, lack of commitment, lack of ownership, just holy moly. I hear it all the time now.
He has so many amazing stories, and I'm not going to repeat his stories because it would not do it justice. No. If you've never watched either of them, and this is why I say, if you're a reader, get the book, but listen to the Audible version because you hear it in his voice. You hear it in their voices what goes on. If you haven't seen him on YouTube, go onto YouTube and watch the man talk. Hey, I'm glad he's on our team. Yeah. He is huge. And this is who I want.
Is he a big guy?
He's huge. He's a Navy SEAL.
Yeah, I knew that part. Yeah.
It's hey, this is the guy I want defending us. But two,
good.
with his stories, he'll go into, hey, there are no such thing as bad teams, only bad leaders. How many times have I ever said, oh, it's not my fault, it's my team's fault? And he would say, no, it's actually your fault. Are you the leader? Well, yeah, it's your fault. Yeah. You allowed it to happen.
Yeah.
And I really had to check myself there. What do you mean there's no bad teams? I know what I'm doing. I'm the most competent person on the team. It would be working perfectly if everyone worked just like I did. And they don't. Yeah. So therefore, it's their fault. He would say, no, it's the leader's fault.
Yeah.
That's so countercultural. What do you mean it's the leader's fault? The leader knows what they're doing. Why is it his or her fault?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's the leader who ultimately, and again, it's not, I think the key is it's not an objective is or isn't the leader's fault. It's around the mindset that leader must have, that they are absolutely attempting to control everything in their sphere. So it's not an objective description of who's at fault. Like it's not a black and white answer of like, okay, there's 6 people here and number 3 is at fault, right? It's every one of those 6 people has to all have the mindset that if anything goes wrong, it is their fault and they are doing everything to continue to improve, right? And so it also takes a radical amount of trust, because you could have pretty abusive relationships if that takes place, right? You could have 1 or 2 who just totally bring down the rest because they refuse to have that mindset. And if they don't get kicked off the team, then it becomes a festering problem, right? Because then you get some codependent relationships.
Oh, very, very much so. And I love when he says, no bad teams, only bad leaders. And he has a lot of good stories of basically, hey, here's one great team and one very mediocre or poor team.
Yeah.
You take the leader from the great team onto the poor team. And it exceeded, same sense of characters on both sides.
Yep.
And the poor team now is overperforming the other team.
Yeah.
And he goes, all I did was that they changed the leaders.
Yeah. Well, that speaks to volumes to the fact that leaders have an outsized influence. I mean, the other thing actually I liked what he talked about was the importance of sort of leaders knowing their influence. Yeah, I was thinking about that actually. I worked for basically helped to oversee a medical group, and in partnership with my boss, helped to oversee 900 primary and specialty care docs, right? And the man had plenty of good qualities, but he'd been sort of in the organization 30 years and had some very outdated management principles. But was most interesting was after 30 years, his complete lack of understanding his leadership influence. He didn't know that when he would walk into a room, and this guy was like as docile as like a friendly house cat. I mean, he was super like not ambitious, didn't have an ego, great in that sense, right? Fit the organization well in that regard. But he didn't see, or I had to explain to him, I was like, you have to understand when you come in the room, people sit up straight, people get nervous, people are afraid of what you have to be careful what you say. Because he just didn't understand his leadership influence. And I think a lot of people who haven't been in those roles, or they have the wrong personality for those roles, really don't understand how to show up in the right way, right? Because leaders, either you can over leverage on your influence and sort of really make people angry, or you can try to be too docile and too passive, and sort of people then start reading into your words because you're not clear and you're not direct and you're not decisive, and therefore people put words in your mouth because they want you to be decisive and they want you to be direct and they want you to give feedback, so they're going to assume what you're telling them is, he's trying to say da-da-da-da. It may not be what you're saying at all. But it's certainly, I've had that experience, and I was thinking about that in this book when I I remember that. That's a huge problem.
It's one of those things. As we take extreme ownership over ourselves, over our families, over our teams, what they're saying, Jocko and Leif, no bad teams, only bad leaders. But then he gets into what's called the laws of combat. And now I was never part of the armed forces, though I've had relatives, friends that have been, and several family members that have been. So I respect that and understand it. But he calls it, the laws of combat, starting with covering and moving. You cover and you move. You cover and you move. And so here you have, he uses the story of Iraq. You have there's no rules. Basically, what's going down into the cities that he's, but you have to be able to cover and move. So even though we just started no bad teams, only bad leaders, he is using examples of what it looks like. Hey, Josh, you're going to go that way. We're going to go this way. And they have a lot of success stories, but a lot of great mistakes that they made.
Near misses. Really
a lot
near
of near
misses.
misses. Or a lot of misses.
Scary
that
ones. Yeah.
Frantically, people died because of mistakes. That's one thing, like, hey, if we screw up in business, we lose some money. They screw up. People perish.
Talk about pressure.
So covering and moving,
Yeah, what I liked about that chapter was, and this was actually one. It was funny. It's funny a couple times in the book. This was one of them where they would address something that I'd been thinking about, like trying to not be skeptical of the book, but like, well, how does this work? But because one of the things, a lot of roles in consulting, especially in coaching, especially you would get this right. We do a lot of influencing and not a lot of decision making, right? Because we work with the decision makers and we work on behalf of the decision makers, and we give perspectives and opinions and second opinions to the decision makers, right? And they kind of have to make the decision themselves. We can't really force them, right? And I was struggling with that, thinking, well, how does this work in roles, either internal roles or consulting and coaching roles? But he sort of answered it here, right? As he talked about, you can't forget about the greater group, right? Because in that cover and move, right, he talks about how he sort of realized after he got back, while safely, he didn't actually rely on the other oversight watch group, that's not the right term, but the oversight sniper group, to basically cover him getting in. He didn't actually ask them to stay where they were, which was a safer, closer distance to the base. And so that sort of reminded me of a lot of roles and opportunities I've had. He tells a story about in business about a different company and kind of conflict between subsidiaries, and they basically said, well, yes, but you are owned by the same company, so you actually are able to influence that one in some way. And so that was interesting, because I've had a lot of experiences trying to figure out how do you have an ownership mindset when you're in roles that actually don't have any formal decision authority.
Yeah, because you might say, hey, I am just an employee.
I am just an employee, or I'm just an advisor, or I'm just a, it's easy to put limits on yourself.
It really is. And I would say, now I'm going to put words into his mouth. Yes. Laws of combat. I would say a law is, we always use the term we. Now, whether it's your company or you work for someone else, you use the term we, not me or I, or it's their fault. Yeah. We. And I go back to, almost 20 years ago. When I used to work for Verizon Wireless, it's hard because literally at the time there were 500,000, 500,000 employees from Verizon and Verizon Wireless, and I was just one of many. And understanding, it was about me. If you came in to buy a cell phone, you didn't want to hear, well, it's someone else's fault. No, you were working with me. And I literally felt like at that time, Verizon was my company, and it was. They paid for my paycheck.
Right.
And so a lot of it's just understanding, hey, as we're covering and moving, the laws of combat, it is your team. It is our team. We are part of a team. And that is why the U.S. military is the best military, because it functions as one full cohesive unit.
Albeit large bureaucracy, as they say.
Oh, absolutely. We all know there's problems, but still, it works, and we cover and move as an entire organization.
And I would say this, speaking from a consulting perspective and having done both engagements as an individual and as a team, I learned early on from other people, I can't claim credit for this, but good consulting groups will and only will, in front of you, the client, use the word we. And if they ever don't use the word we, don't work with them.
Run
away. And I can tell you a couple, I just had this example recently. I've got a client who I'm working with on a project. I won't get into it. We have basically a technology team building them a digital solution, and it's going to be great. But we've got major problems on the delivery side of the team for lots of reasons. And I won't get into those, and I certainly won't give away the project, but or the client or any of the situation. But what in particular, we had a member who was having trouble with their role, and I was on a client call. My responsibility is working with the client exclusively and helping to basically pull out of them what they need, helping to advise on what they looking for, and then translating that for the group. So I'm just kind of key strategy and kind of translator. And there was this one particular instance where one person had taken it upon themselves to do some analysis, which I'm okay. wanted to join the call. I think they were having some trouble feeling undervalued and or unclear in their role, and so they chose to get on the call and go, I, and I immediately, we got through that call, and I called and talked to her boss and said, this is not happening again. So we, absolutely, because it's a team. It has to be a team. And it doesn't matter if one person did 99% of the work, because it is a unified front, has to be, or you completely ruin both the team dynamics and you ruin the understanding of your client's perspective on what you're bringing to the table, what you're doing, that you're maybe delivering different messages, or that you're not unified, and that just creates the wrong dynamic. So it's very important, and not something to be underestimated.
Mm-hmm. And from a coaching perspective, one of the things I love about this book, and I used to think, coaching, if you ever wonder, what's the difference between coaching and consulting? Coaching is really getting someone to understanding their role in the process, as you know. And it's the difference between I and we. And in a coaching endeavor, when I'm coaching someone, a lot of people think, oh, you just need to tell, hey, go over there and you'll do it this way. That's not it. It's about looking at yourself. What do I bring to the table? And that's why I like extreme ownership, because it's literally, what do I bring to the table? Right. Look at ourselves first. Any problems? What did I do?
Yeah, and that's a good way to differentiate too. When you're talking about yourself, it's when you are reflecting and when you are trying to improve yourself, versus when you are communicating externally. It's almost entirely a we, especially when there's credit to be had. It's a we. Thank you. We did that. We did that. We did that. Right. Versus I can improve. I take responsibility.
And so the book ends. Just great. This is a huge quick overview of the book. Next podcast is on the business application, then followed up on life application. So we're going to come back to this. How does it apply to our business? How does it apply to our lives? But the two, Jocko and Leif, end with sustaining victory. So it's, if we do all this right, then we're going to sustain victory, and we do it this way through extreme ownership. And what I love about this is people think, well, what a miserable way to do life. No, absolutely not. They understand if we are disciplined, it ends with discipline equals freedom.
Yep.
And some people are like, I'm not going to take accountability for this or this. I'm like, why? That's miserable. If we take ownership over ourselves, we have complete freedom. And this is what they see. If anything, we're offering, hey, complete freedom by owning extreme ownership.
Yeah. And I think that one thing it's interesting in the book, it's hard to put words to, but there is a risk to the near term to doing this, right? Because they tell a lot of good stories about, like in the beginning, he talks about how he took ownership in front of his superiors for that blue on blue, right? And there's several other, and I thought about that, like those all turned out well because he had semi-functional people around him, right? There are scenarios where you will take that accountability and someone will say, great, you're fired. Like
absolutely.
Like there are people who are going to be happy to give you that credit and fire you because they don't have the extreme ownership themselves. So I think as we think about this discipline equals freedom concept, I think one of the things to remember, at least as I was reading through it and trying to think through, like there are people in the world who are going to misuse and abuse your willingness to do this kind of thing. And so when you do it eyes wide open, I think, in the sense of you probably will gain respect and trust from people, but not always. No. Right? There will be times that someone will be happy to fire you for this.
And as we work on our discipline, we don't always lay out all of our dirty laundry in every single situation. There's a time and place for that. So in coaching, this is why we have a confidential coaching engagement. So you can lay that stuff out. I am bound by secrecy of the contract. I'm not going to tell whatever you share to me in that coaching relationship. Yeah. And it's so you can grow in that area, because we do know there are some bad people out there. If you lay out what's wrong, they're going to use it against you. Yeah. Which is unfair, because to really grow, you have to have a base level of trust. And this is why when you hear stories of boot camp and all the stuff that they do in the military, it's to establish that base level of trust. Right. Because if you don't have that trust, how do I know you're going to cover me if we're going to flank who we're going against or here? You've got to work cohesively as a team. And I think this is also why you see a lot of former military. They're great in business. Absolute rock stars. Why? They understand extreme ownership, How to Cover a Move, eventually Discipline Equaling Freedom. They are amazing workers.
Yeah, well, and they understand how to go and attack a problem, right? They have a particular methodology that these guys uncover to some degree that helps, I think, anyone who's been in the military, but other particular experiences. I think there's also certain personalities who are prone to sort of be willing to do this, right? There's certain individuals who learn this easier than others. So the degree to which there's, I would say to people listening to this, if you're really good at sort of attaching these concepts and building this accountability into your life, great, keep at it. If you're not, get help, right? Read this book, get someone to coach you or give you reflection on where you're at with everything so that you can be better with the mindset. Even if you don't have that military experience, you can and be more thoughtful around this idea of extreme ownership.
And in our organization, I would say about 15% of our organization are veterans. And the cool thing, even though I've never served, they tell me so many stories, and it's great. And they're like, Erik, this is how things are. Erik, this is what I learned here. And it's one of those things, I thoroughly respect them, and they've really helped our organization out. And so, Jocko and Leif, I always say Jocko because he's like the big guy behind it all. But, Leif Babin wrote the book with him. He even gets into decisiveness and uncertainty. What do we do when we're uncertain? So it's not just, it's kind of like what you talked about. Right. We don't always know what's going to happen. We have ideas. There are principles for success. But they even get into what happens if we're uncertain.
Yeah. And I think this is where you have to sort of art and science meet, right? This is when I work with executives. It's, hey, here's the questions we can answer, and let's be honest about the questions we can't answer.
Absolutely.
And no amount of spinning the data for another 90 days is going to answer that question for you, and you just have to live with that uncertainty. And I like how he summarizes that so concisely, right? And helping people recognize the risks they can control, the risks they can't control, and not over-indexing on those risks that you can't control. I mean, you can't control some of these things that happen, and so you just keep forging ahead with the information you have. Yeah.
Next time is how are we applying it to our businesses in coaching, in consulting. So that is next week.
Got a lot of good stories for that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
We are full of stories on that. But in the meantime, until then, this is one of the few books I would say, buy the print version of the book.
Yep.
Get the Audible version, and even get the Kindle. So this is one of those things. This is so good. Get all three so you have it.
Why can't you just make one purchase and get all three? I want to know that. That's a thought I had.
Well, the nice thing on Amazon, they do give you a little discount when you get the Kindle.
But you should just be able to pay like $30 and get all three. I mean, it should just be easy. Anyhow, another thought for another day.
That's for our book.
There you go.
But hey, in the meantime, reach out to us on the consultantofthecoach.com, comment on our YouTube link, any questions that you have. Hey, how do you apply extreme ownership? Or what do you think about this? I disagree with this portion of the book. We'd love to hear it.
Yep.
But anyway, until next week, hey, thanks for listening to us.
Take it easy.